Hi, welcome to Rock and Metal Invasion. My name is Steve. On today's episode, I'm going to be doing Game Changers, rock and metal albums that have been influential and important. And not just to the music industry, but to myself personally. So these are albums or bands that have come out with releases that have introduced me or got me interested in another type of rock or metal music that perhaps previously I hadn't listened to before. And in some cases, maybe they've created an entirely new subgenre. So as you probably know, if you've been looking at my videos up to now, there's been a big emphasis on the 80s hard rock, early 90s hard rock, which is sometimes called hair metal. A lot of the bands I feature in my videos would fit the hair metal category, and I love those bands. I love that kind of music, and have since it really came into prominence during the 80s. But of course, as we all know, in 1991, things started to change a little bit, and some people might say it was this band here and this release, Nirvana. Smells Like Teen Spirit was the big single from this album. The album's called Nevermind. This came out in 1991. Some people might say that it's the album and Nirvana is the band that killed hair metal. Other people, of course, might say hair metal sort of killed itself. I sort of tend to think it's sort of a combination of the two things. But definitely, when this came out, it really made people think about alternative rock, made people think about the image that perhaps was being represented in rock and metal, and suddenly some of those hair metal bands seemed a little bit juvenile, perhaps. Lyrically, they didn't seem to be that interesting, and musically, this sounded like something that some people hadn't heard before. So it was definitely, of course, the start of grunge, but I think also the start of alternative rock music entering the mainstream. And it wasn't as though hair metal just died overnight. I've showed plenty of the hair metal bands who released albums in 1992, but they didn't tend to be successful, and they were slowly starting to fade away. Meanwhile, of course, because of the success of a band like Nirvana, you started then seeing more grunge bands entering into being played on radio, and thus becoming more popular. Because a lot of the, back in 1991, early 90s, or even in the 80s, in fact, pretty much up till now, you could even say, but certainly before the internet, radio had a big part to play in the popularity of bands and, their success that they had. If they got airplay, that had a big impact on their success. So, Nirvana and Smells Like Teen Spirit, I remember hearing that on the radio, and it was like a moment where I just thought to myself, because I was listening to the radio, and it was a song that I didn't remember, the kind of song I didn't remember ever hearing on the radio before. It sounded heavy, it rocked, and I just remember thinking to myself, who is this band? And I think I missed it, or, radio sometimes tends to just play a song and not tell you who it was. And so I didn't know straight away, but I remember sort of thinking in my head, I wonder if it was this band or that band, but I really couldn't quite guess who it was. Obviously, eventually I saw the music video, and I am someone who really likes Nirvana. I know some people who are fans of the hair metal genre never really got into Nirvana or got into the grunge scene, but I wasn't particularly. I don't have a massive collection of grunge albums, or even I wouldn't say I'm a massive fan of the grunge bands, but I do like Soundgarden, I do like Alice in Chains. But my favourite band that came along and started the whole grunge era was Nirvana. So their first album, I also have the follow-up, and I didn't buy it, of course, when it came out initially, but I got the debut, Bleach, which of course came out before Nevermind. It's also a great album. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Nirvana. So they were probably, you could argue, the most influential band, or one of the most influential bands of all time, because as some people have said, they almost killed hair metal and killed a whole genre of music, and really made life difficult for, I guess, the Slaughters and the Motley Crues and the Dokkens and even Def Leppard and Bon Jovi had to rethink things a little bit. So that was 1991, and that really set into motion a bit of a change, as I talked about earlier, in the music industry. And then in 1992, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now, because it was a big year for rock and metal music in some ways, because the groundwork was laid for what was to come in the future, because we had releases from a band called Pantera. This is Vulgar Display of Power. Now, this is not, of course, their first album. In fact, they had released albums in the 80s, which were perhaps a little bit hair metal. I'd call them more just sort of straight heavy metal, really, but they did look they had a bit of a hair metal image at times. But, of course, they got together with Phil Anselmo. The first album with Phil Anselmo wasn't really a big change from the sound that they had, but then Cowboys from Hell, they really started to develop this new sound, and then I think it really came into play on this album. They really got it all together. Just fantastic album from start to finish. So many classic songs on this: Mouth for War, Walk, A New Level. I mean, the first, for me, the first 6 songs are just amazing. Fucking Hostile, great song, and influential for me, because when I heard that, I was like, up to then, I think I'd pretty much just been listening to, the Motley Crues and Dokken and that sort of stuff. Judas Priest, I like some of the heavier bands as well, but I think that was probably at the time when that came out, it was one of the heavier bands that I was into. And, of course, that album was very successful. And then their next album, which was Far Beyond Driven, went to number 1. And it could be perhaps the heaviest album to ever get to number 1 on the album charts. Other heavy metal bands, of course, have got to number 1, Quiet Riot, Skid Row, but Vulgar Display of Power must be probably Far Beyond Driven must be one of the heaviest albums to make it to number 1 on the charts. So this one came out in 1994, and I have to say, of course, 1994, things weren't looking great for metal. In fact, you could argue, through the 90s, it was really only Pantera, I guess Megadeth, Metallica. There were a few, metal bands that were still doing fairly well, but those days in the 80s where you had so many bands that, whether you want to call them metal or not, they were certainly in the metal genre or category, that were being successful making the charts in the 90s. I guess that those bands had been replaced. Those hair metal bands had been replaced by grunge bands. So you had Stone Temple Pilots, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, those bands I talked about before. Pearl Jam, you might say Blind Melon. So those bands were, getting the airplay and getting the success in the chart, getting the chart success as well. But yeah, there was still a few, what you would call heavy metal bands that were still there, but it was as people have said before, a bit of a tough time for metal. But so we had Vulgar Display of Power in 1992. 1992 though was I think a big year, because a lot of albums got released by, or debut releases from bands who would end up being very influential. And one of those bands was a band called Rage Against the Machine. So this album came out in 1992, and very influential as far as merging rap and so hip hop or rap and heavy metal together, right? So those hard, heavy riffs with rap vocals. Zach De La Rocha, fantastic vocalist. Tom Morello, we all know what an amazing guitar player he is. I think his idea was he was into hip hop, he was into Public Enemy, and he thought, I wonder if I can get those sort of sounds that I hear when I'm listening to a rap album onto a rock or metal album with my guitar. And then with a great frontman like Zach De La Rocha, it just all got put together into this into an album that sounds like no other album that had come out before. I mean, yes, rap metal had come out before. People had tried to do rap metal, but nothing at all that sounded like that and had been done that well. So, highly influential band. Of course, later on there'd be a lot more bands that would sound a little bit like that. But at the time, there was Rage Against the Machine, and then there was no one else that really sounded like them. Another really influential band that had a release in 1992 was not a full album release, but one of my favourite bands, at least they were back in the 90s, is Tool. And their EP, this is a 6-track EP that came out in 1992. It does only have 6 tracks on it, but every track is just awesome. I would probably, for me, I know some people might say they're prog metal. I think they've definitely got more progressive as they've gone on, but I would sort of say they influenced the alternative metal scene of what was to come with this album and their follow-up album as well. This is, like I said, a 6-track. I guess you could say this is an EP, but very influential as far as alternative metal is concerned. Shorter songs on this, sort of around 3 or 4 minute songs. So it rocks really hard. Maynard's got such great vocals. Great riffs. I heard this again, unlike anything I'd heard before. Some people might say, "Oh no, there were a couple other bands that sound like this at the time." None of that I know of, and I certainly went around looking for bands. Is there another band that sounds like Tool? And I couldn't find them. It took a while for bands to come out that sounded like that. But so then so that was 92, and then you had Undertow in 93. But yeah, 1992, a big year. So you have Pantera, Rage Against the Machine, and Tool releasing their debut releases. Not Pantera wasn't debut, but it was a very influential release. And Tool and Rage Against the Machine with their debut releases. And then there's one more from 1992, and this is quite an influential album as well. And again, when this came out, I'd heard nothing else that really sounded like this, and I just couldn't stop playing it. I just loved it. Thought it was amazing. This wasn't their debut album. This is their second album, and it's a band called Caius and Blues for the Red Sun. This is probably their best album for me, but fantastic. So I guess what you could say, they were very influential in that sort of stoner rock, stoner metal scene. Of course, this band then evolved a little bit into what became Queens of the Stone Age. For me, Caius is just a fantastic band. Josh Homme, of course, from Caius, he then went on to Queens of the Stone Age. But for me, this is the best music he did was when he was with Caius. And they did two more albums after this, which have just been re-released again on vinyl, which is great. They have been issued before on vinyl, but they can get pretty pricey. So they had Welcome to Sky Valley and The Circus Leaves Town. And they were released on Elektra back in the 90s, the Elektra label, but didn't really get that much success. Unlike Tool and Rage Against the Machine and Pantera, who were releasing influential albums, they charted quite well and had success. Class, not so much. It took a long time for that word of mouth to get out, and by then I think they'd pretty much broken up, and of course they started then to evolve into Queens of the Stone Age. But they had Josh on vocals. The vocalist for Kyuss, John Garcia, is he's a fantastic vocalist. So I think that might be one part of Queens of the Stone Age that I kind of miss. So not having him on vocals, and it's one of the big factors in how much I liked Kyuss. So that was 92, a really big year. But also, I'd have to say, as far as influential bands is concerned, 1994 was a big year for this band, Korn. So very influential, of course, with the new metal scene. And I guess you could argue new metal, like hair metal, is probably too sort of... I'm not really, again, just like hair metal, I'm not really sure that new metal is actually a genre, but at the very least, when a lot of new metal bands were coming out, it was called new metal. Unlike hair metal bands were coming out that wasn't even known as hair metal at the time. It's a label that's been given, later on. It was given later on. At the time, when new metal bands were coming out with releases, they were sort of called new metal, even though again I just don't think that makes sense, because some of the bands that were being called new metal sounded completely different to some of the other bands that were called new metal. But I guess the influence for that new metal sound came from this album and the subsequent releases from Korn, and I really like these albums. So this is Korn, self-titled, and there was Life is Peachy, and this one might be one of my favourite ones, but the first three are all fantastic. Follow the Leader. Lost a little bit of interest in them after that, and since then, but those first three are fantastic. And then, like I said, you had quite a few bands coming out after that were given the new metal tag, they didn't necessarily sound like Korn, but they were one of the... What was great about Korn was it was finally a new band coming out, in the mid-90s that was heavy and was successful, because there hadn't been a metal band or band that you could put in the metal category had been successful for quite some time. There'd be a lot of the grunge bands. Just one more band I want to mention from 1994 that was very influential, at least especially influential to me, and that is Machine Head. So this came out in 1994, Burn My Eyes, and this was really influential to me, especially because I think when this came out, I started to investigate a lot more heavier bands. So this was, again, a little bit like Pantera with Vulgar Display of Power. At the time, that was probably the heaviest album I had in my collection, and I started investigating some other heavier bands, and the Machine Head sort of did a similar thing. I started looking at other artists, especially they were out on the Roadrunner label, so I started looking at other bands that were on that label. So that really took me down that road of listening to some heavier stuff. But it's just a killer album from start to finish, fantastic. For me, probably still their best album, but big Machine Head fan, and enjoyed all their albums. So that was that came out in '94. Even though you had bands like Korn and Machine Head putting out albums and being fairly successful, it did take a little while for that new metal scene to develop. But then when it did, there was it seemed to be like a new metal band, well, so-called new metal band, releasing an album almost weekly, at least one every week sort of thing. So it got a bit like hair metal. There was just bands after bands releasing new material every week. One of those bands, they released this in 1999, and yep, they were definitely given the new metal tag when it came out, but they're still going strong today. Probably one of the most successful metal bands of all time, and one of the heaviest bands to also be successful, and that would be Slipknot, of course. So from 1999, this is their self-titled album. I guess one aspect of being a new metal band is that they had a DJ. They had a bit of an outfit sort of thing happening here, but that was just one part of them. They obviously have a lot of members in the band, but produced by Ross Robinson as well. So there's that link to Korn. But over time they've established themselves as being just a really fantastic band. Again, a little bit like Korn though. First three releases, fantastic. I've lost a little bit of interest over time with their last few releases, but definitely love their first three. So that's pretty much it for me, influential bands and how they've influenced the music industry. But I'll just cover a few bands that I think heard those bands or were influenced by those bands, and then ended up perhaps influencing a newer generation and having a lot of success. So one, I guess, a band that was probably a little bit of a surprise success because they do not sound mainstream in any way. They sound very original, but they had massive success, and I'm a big fan, is System of a Down. Now, this is not their first album, but this album really took off for them. Toxicity and Chop Suey, their first single from this album. I still can listen to that song, and I totally love it. So they were a band, I think, probably influenced by what happened with the alternative rock and new metal scene, and then they had their own sound, and they had lots of success. Of course, Limp Bizkit, very successful, following on from Korn. Again, they've got that Ross Robinson connection. I'm not the biggest Limp Bizkit fan, but I know that bands like Limp Bizkit, and then of course you had Linkin Park, not critically perhaps acclaimed, but I think that Limp Bizkit's first couple of albums, same with Linkin Park. So this is their debut and their follow-up album. I really like them. I enjoy listening to them. And of course, they took those influences and produced albums that that were in a lot of ways even more successful than the bands who had influenced them. So they had even more success than perhaps the Nirvanas and the Korns and the Machine Heads or whoever had influenced them. They took that sound and then they created their own albums and then had even more success with it. I guess another band I'd probably talk about in regards to that would be, and this is not a cool band to like, but I do quite like them, Nickelback. So no doubt about it, they have Nirvana influences, but they've taken that grunge sound, and I guess they would be called a post-grunge band, and basically had mainstream success. They're a bit hit and miss for me, but some of their songs I really like, some of them I don't like so much. But and I know that just like Limp Bizkit, Nickelback's probably one of those bands you probably shouldn't like. But what can I say? I do like them, and the numbers don't lie. This album in particular, this one here, All the Right Reasons, is diamond certified. So that's like 10 times platinum, I think. So there's people out there who like it. Yeah, I think it's just, again, taking those influences that those bands that I talked about at the start of my video had, and then developing it into perhaps a more commercial sound. That's what happened with bands like Limp Bizkit and Nickelback. Alright, well, that's it for my video for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you later. See ya.